Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and how great to have as our guest this morning Dr. Ron Paul. For the three people in the audience who don't know about Dr. Paul, I'll just say he was, of course, a longtime congressman from Texas, the chairman of the Domestic Monetary Policy Subcommittee, the great champion of the gold standard of international peace, of free markets in public life, of course, a candidate for president again this time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And author of many books, most recently End the Fed and Liberty Defined. And Ron, great to have you. And I want to ask you about something that's right in the news at this moment that is of special interest to you. What about this whole alleged Iranian terrorism plot and the fact that some people want to use this as an excuse to kill a lot of Iranians?
You know, this scares me to no end. Not being scared of the Iranians or this guy, but it scares me to death to think that they can take a perfectly lousy misfit who's been a little bit, had bizarre behavior for a long time, all of a sudden get this much attention on the top headline of every newspaper in the country that has put us on the verge of another war. I mean, the reaction is just astounding. I hope we can counteract that and try to tone it down. But to think that they'd be willing to go to war over this, and now they're upping the ante, you know, against the Iranians right now, I think this is very, very dangerous. And obviously, though, this is just an excuse for them to do what they've wanted to do all along, looking for an excuse to go in and start tearing up that country.
And, of course, it is alarming, and thank goodness for you that you've been the one voice of reason and of sanity on the whole question. Of course, these people, when Obama or the Republicans, too, say that nothing should be left off the table with Iran, they're talking about just killing everybody. They're talking about mass murder.
Well, when they say nothing left off the table, that means they'd use nukes if they wanted to. And I'm afraid there are some of those individuals that are quite willing to do that. But that's why it's very scary. And of course, it's the old saying, whether it had to do with 9/11 or bin Laden or whatever, that if you even question it or suggest that there's other ways to do something, then, you know, we're unpatriotic and we're un-American, and this Constitution means nothing. So I go back and forth, because there are some days when I'm especially talking to the young people. They're very much attuned into what we've been talking about for years. At the same time, you see the neocons who are still in charge in Washington of both parties, then it becomes pretty scary. So I'm just hoping that we can speed up the transition so we can have some thoughtful people involved in Washington rather than the current crop of people we have there now.
Ron, you've been the great champion, as I mentioned, of sound money, the great opponent of the central bank as unconstitutional and obviously an economic disaster, a political disaster. But you have really made progress against Greenspan, against Bernanke, against the whole central bank system, and now through your subcommittee. I mean, we're seeing questions asked and people interested in things that they never were interested in before.
No, and I think that is a lot of progress, but you know, institutions like the Mises Institute and others who've been doing the legwork on this for not a year or two, but for a couple decades, I think that is making a difference. I think the fact that we have more teachers than ever before, I keep thinking about how things were in the 1920s and 30s. In the 20s, everybody talked about free enterprise, and Roosevelt ran on free enterprise and the gold standard. At the same time, the intellectual community had changed, and they were all socialists and Keynesians. I hope it's reversed right now, because I think the subtle understanding in the intellectual community has changed away from Keynesianism, and that that we're winning the intellectual fight. So in that way, I'm optimistic, but then there are days when you see the insanities that continue that we don't, you know, we wonder what will happen. But I think the discussion has changed, even though I'm sure you noticed I don't get as much time on those debates as others. but somebody wrote and they said, yeah, but they're always talking about some of the issues that I brought up. So if they're talking about the Fed, but you know, it does get a little aggravating when they talk about the Fed and they distort it or they try to tone it down, and I want my chance to clarify something. Sometimes it's very hard to get my two words in.
Well, I must say at this recent debate at Dartmouth, I thought they were so outrageously biased against you that it actually hurt them. I mean, that they're discussing all these issues that are your specialties and pretending you don't exist. So I think certainly all the people I talked to's reaction, even people who don't agree with you 100%, thought that it was just a crime what Charlie Rose was doing. And of course, he represents the establishment. Establishment's scared of you. And just look at, I mean, there was a recent article in the Economist by a guy blaming you. He said Bernanke hasn't given us all the money creation and credit creation that he should have to save us all, because Ron Paul has introduced all these terrible ideas and is restricting Bernanke. So, I think he had actually a point. I mean, Bernanke does feel under pressure. He does feel under scrutiny, like no Fed chairman, I think, has ever been. And that's because of you.
I was always delighted, when he had to answer back and go and have press conferences and other things. So he has a full-time PR person now, trying to portray him in the media in a certain way. But it used to be very secret, and they didn't have to do that. Well, they're still way too secret, but at least we're exposing their secrecy that keeps the people from knowing exactly what they've been up to.
I thought something else you were responsible for. There was a recent program on the History Channel asking whether there's any gold in Fort Knox. And they treated you fairly. And I thought there was something to be gained just by the fact that they asked the question, is it coin melt? Is all the gold there? Even if the gold is all there, who owns it? And this is the issue you've raised. And, it's a great thing to see in the mainstream media taking something like this seriously.
Yeah, and I'm sure you remember when we were working on the Gold Commission, I brought the subject up back then. We were talking about the gold in relationship to the monetary system because there was a crisis going on then, and the vote was 15-2 against auditing the gold. Here we're studying the gold in relationship to the monetary system, and nobody wanted to find out if we owned any of the gold yet. But more and more people are starting to understand this. Of course, my position on that is not so much to worry about how they're going to reinstate their gold standard. I just assume they sell the gold and legalize its use in this country. And I think that transition would work better than pretending that we can phase out the Fed and institute another pseudo gold standard, which I think some are working on. They'll talk about maybe we can use a little bit of gold in this new standard, and the IMF can manage it. That I think is the thing that we have to be on alert for.
Thinking of the IMF, I remember back a few years when Henry Royce, the chairman of the House Banking Committee, I guess then, was advocating more money for the IMF, and you suggested, well, why doesn't the IMF just sell its gold? And, of course, he freaked out, right? They all freaked out at having this question asked. But isn't that a good question right now, too?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, Henry Royce was the great economist who said if you ever legalize gold, he says that would be good because gold, we prop up the price of gold. If we legalized it, the gold would go down to $5 an ounce. So he missed that call a little bit, too.
Ron, what's happening in your campaign is so exciting, and I remember 4 years ago when you were at the Values Voters Summit, and after you said that you worship the Prince of Peace, they booed you. This time it was a little bit different. This time you won the straw poll, you had the crowd chanting for you, and you talked about how war affects the family. If people are concerned about the status of the family, they can't be for these perpetual wars, and people liked what you had to say. So what's going on? I mean, is even among these people that your ideas are starting to penetrate?
Well, the managers of that convention explained it all. The ones who counted the ballots claim we stuffed the ballot box and there was a gross distortion. No, I think the sentiment has changed. The attitude on the war has changed in these last 4 years. People are getting tired of it, and I think some of these factual things that I pointed out, even though they're in the religious realm and they're biblical, but that's the kind of conference that we were having there. And matter of fact, they ask us not to be political because they are a 501c3. I think the others didn't hesitate for a minute to be talking about the president and talking about campaigns. So I tried to stay on that theme. But of course, a lot of our supporters went that had a little different view and had a different understanding of the First Amendment and how we should treat religious values. But no, I think there has been a shift. I think the attitude has changed against the war, and we all know exactly what their policies do. And I didn't get to mention it in there, and I probably could have. And that is how these wars are detrimental to not only family life in these countries that we're bombing, but to the Christian values. I mean, how many countries have we run out? Christians were in Iraq for, what, a couple thousand years?
From the very beginning.
Now they've practically been run out. The same thing in Afghanistan.
No, and the same thing is going to happen in Syria. If the U.S. efforts succeed there, all the Christians who've been in Syria since the very beginning of Christianity will be killed or certainly ethnically cleansed.
Yeah, you know, this